Good afternoon. My name is Youssef, and I'm a project manager at Tradewater. I'd like to welcome you today to the side of us on carbon markets and how they fill a hole in the Montreal Protocol. This event is hosted by Tradewater. We are a mission-based environmental projects developer. Our mission is to fight climate change and create local economic opportunities by providing an end-of-life destruction solutions to potent high-impact greenhouse gases, which include ozone-depleting substances, ODS. We are based in the US, but we operate in different countries. We have developed projects in 4 continents. Currently we are working on projects in more than a dozen countries around the world. And so far, we've destroyed 7 million tons of CO2 equivalent, and we are on track to destroy more than 22 million in the next 5 years. Our QR code is here for you to have more details on where and how we execute our projects. We invite you to check these details, and please let us know if you have any questions. We leverage carbon markets to execute our work, which means that we can provide these services, the collection and extraction of these ODS gases, at no cost to governments and other stakeholders. And today, Tradewater has brought together experts who will shed some light on carbon markets and how they play a crucial role to finance this work and the responsible disposal of ODS and HFCs globally around the world. María, José, Gutiérrez, our international senior director of international programs at Tradewater, will speak about how we'll shed some light on basic notions on the carbon markets. And Tilden Chao from Yale Carbon Containment Lab will help shed more light on how these carbon markets are applied on ODS and HFC products. Tilden helps lead Yale's strategy on financing the mitigation of ODS around the world. And I thank him so much for joining us today and for his thank you so much for joining today. And without further ado, we can start with the first presentation. María, José, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Youssef. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to our side event. So I wanted to thank you. I would like to basically introduce you all a little bit to carbon markets. And I apologize in advance if some of you already know some of these basics, but I want to try and cover the basics, and then maybe if you have more advanced questions, those are welcome too. But I thought it would be good to just cover some of the key concepts around carbon markets. Global view, carbon markets basically, carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases have the same impact whether they happen here or on the other side of the world. They have a global impact. So when we absorb through, say, a forest or avoid one of these emissions on one side of the world, it has a global impact as well, positive impact in that case. So in theory, the theory of carbon markets, stakeholders can cancel out the impact of some of their emissions by investing in projects that prevent or absorb some of these greenhouse gases in a different part of the world. So that's the principle behind a carbon market. Essentially, it's a market of these avoidance and the capture of emissions. So what is a carbon offset credit? It is mitigation of greenhouse gases can be done in 2 ways. As I've just introduced before, it can be direct removal, such as a forest that captures CO2 from the atmosphere and absorbs it, or we can prevent emissions, for example, as the work Tradewater that Youssef has just introduced does, by destroying some of these end-of-life ODS and keeping them from reaching the atmosphere altogether. So one offset credit, carbon offset credit, equals 1 ton of CO2 equivalent that is either removed or prevented. So carbon offset credit is basically the equivalent to this 1 metric ton, as I just said, that was either prevented or captured. So a carbon market works in the following way. We basically have an upfront investment that is made so that actions can happen to prevent or avoid or capture these emissions. that generates these carbon offsets, and then companies or individuals or countries even, and Tilden will speak a little bit more about that, can choose to pay so that this investor recovers their investment, pay for the carbon offset credits so that those actions were able to happen to basically cover the investment needed to take those actions. So the purchase of carbon offset credits allows for, one, the emission capture and prevention to be funded that otherwise wouldn't be, and that's one of the principles of carbon markets as well. And two, for entities, organizations, and individuals and countries, potentially, to offset their own emissions in a verified and potentially more efficient way, a cost efficient or whatever that can be. So a couple of key concepts. One of them that's very important here is additionality. You may have heard this before, but basically in the context of a carbon market, additionality is the property of an activity being, and the word says, additional to what would have happened otherwise. So we can see on this graph here, we have the emission levels, and these are the emission levels, say, over the course of time. And this is what they would be unless we do a certain project to reduce that, to generate less emissions, to avoid or prevent those. And that's where this would be additional. If, for example, if emission reductions or removals would not have occurred without the revenue of carbon markets, that is additionality. That also, as we can see here defined in the American Carbon Registry, eligible offsets must be generated by projects that yield additional GHG reductions that exceed any that otherwise would have occurred by law or regulation. So that means, for example, and I'm getting a little bit into Tilden's presentation about ODS, for example, if a country has a mandate to destroy MDS, then in theory, that will occur without carbon markets. It's supposed to occur anyways. So there wouldn't be no additionality if that's the case, to give you an example. The other key concept I thought of introducing here, if you're not familiar, some of you may very well be, but is the carbon equivalent concept basically. And on this graph are the ozone depleting potentials of several gases that you will maybe very familiar with. As you can see, the action of the Montreal Protocol has led from the most ozone depleting to the least ozone depleting to achieve zero ozone depletion potential in the newest gases that are being introduced and used more and more today. But there also exists what is called the global warming potential, aside from the ozone depletion potential. And as we can see here, despite these going down from 1.8 to 0, the global warming potential hasn't necessarily followed exactly the same trend. It has been going somewhat down here from what it could have been before in CFCs and CFCs and SF6, for example. But it's not at 0 yet. And so if this is the agenda of why some of these gases, including the older gases like CFCs, mostly have these high global warming potentials, which become interest in the context of a carbon market. And CO2, carbon dioxide, has a global warming potential of 1. So we basically use each gas's global warming potential to convert it, as you would a currency, for example, to carbon dioxide, to speak in one single term of carbon. And that's why they're called the carbon markets, despite them including all sorts of other greenhouse gases. So who are the main stakeholders in a carbon market context? These would be the registries, such as Vera, American Carbon Registry, and others, who establish methodologies and standards, so sort of set the rules of the game that one can follow to create carbon credits. There's the project developers, such as Tradewater, for example, who are using these rules to do activities to generate carbon offsets and sell them back into the market. And there's the validation and verification bodies who are accredited by the registries in order to validate and verify a project and make sure that all the rules are complied with. And we have the carbon offset buyers, whether those are individuals, companies, or countries, which in a voluntary space, as this is a question we get often, so I wanted to include it here. In a voluntary market space, the market is essentially global. So if you do a project in one determined country, you don't necessarily have to be able to sell those offsets, resulting offsets into that same country. You can do it to a global market, essentially. And then there's also the space of clients or demand for these offsets from carbon tax or locally mandated in markets, basically, such as California in the US. Yeah. And as for the general process, and again, some of you may be familiar with this, but we essentially need 3 main things: favorable conditions, and you can imagine that's a big concept that includes a lot of things, but wanted to summarize it in that we involve stakeholders, whether those, all of the ones before and those that have the different actions occurring or can happen that would be involved, and the corresponding standard and methodology from the registry. With that, a project is then listed by a project developer under a registry. Then the action happens, whether it's the avoidance or capture action that happens, takes place. And from that, a project document is presented to a VVP, the validation and verification body, that validates and verifies that everything happened according to the rules from the registry and the standard and the methodology. And then they grant, ideally, a green light that would then allow the registry to issue the carbon offsets. So that's essentially, that's a very big picture of a carbon market process. Thank you. The challenges of carbon markets include selling the offsets at the end, and some of you may be familiar with initiatives from the Multilateral Fund, for example, in the past to do some projects, but then there is a challenge of selling the offsets later at the right price and whom and in what time span or time period. There is the challenge of the upfront capital investment. As I showed in that diagram before, somebody needs to put that upfront capital investment to make the project happen. There's the challenge of complying with all applicable rules and regulations, especially in some cases where those may not even be too clear all around in a certain country. These may be things that are being proposed that haven't happened before, and so there hasn't been a need to create clear rules in a country. And this is an opportunity that makes that need appear. The project lifecycle can take years to happen, depending on what the project is, and regulation may change during that project period. So those are some of the challenges that we face. And Yusuf has introduced us a little bit, but I wanted to provide basically just one slide about the business case practical example of Tradewater of this. And you'll see that our little diagram here is basically like the one I showed before about how our carbon market works. So essentially, Tradewater identifies and collects these non-CO2 gases, including ODS. We prevent the release of those gases through destruction, and then verify to generate climate benefits, meaning carbon offsets, and then sell the climate benefits to be able to reinvest that into finding, collecting, and destroying more. So that's that's a practical case of a business. A practical business case of Tradewater, how this works. And just to end, I also wanted to stress a little bit on the difference of carbon offsets that can occur in the carbon market. Some of the things that make an offset credit high quality include permanent. So in our case, for example, the gases are destroyed, period. Those don't have a risk of reappearing because they have been destroyed. Additional, we've covered the term of additionality, but of course, the more additional you can be, or the more that additionality exists, the higher the value of the credits. Accurate as well. So if these credits follow rules, very, very well. There's basically things like, for example, when we do a project, we need to even monitor how often the scale of the destruction facility is calibrated, to the extent that we're making sure that everything we're putting out there is completely accurate and precise. And of course, responsible. So the more you can do, and this is something that came up one of these days at a side event, the more you can do in these projects to not only do the offsetting period, but also invest in local economies, provided kind contributions, or work together with different stakeholders and leave other values as well, the better. And that is my introduction to carbon markets. Thank you very much. I will pass it on to Tilden.
All right, well, thanks so much to Maho and to the Tradewater team for having me. My name is Tilden Chao. I'm an analyst at the Yale Carbon Containment Lab and have the pleasure with my colleague Charlie here of developing and leading our strategy on HFC and ODS mitigation and financing. So my presentation today is about how carbon markets fill gaps in mitigation of HFC and ODS gases. But before we dive in, I'm going to quickly explain who we are and what we do, and then I'll tell you a three-part story about how carbon markets are currently or will fill gaps in ODS and HFC mitigation. But I'll note that we're a nonprofit based at Yale University, and I know that the word lab is in our name, but unlike other university labs, our mandate is not necessarily to teach or publish primary research, but it's instead to take research and to implement it in the real world as it relates to climate mitigation. So we're really excited to bring our knowledge about ODS and HFCs and try to apply it toward mitigation projects. These pictures just showcase some of what Charlie and I have been up to the last few months. We have the great privilege of going out often into the field and trying to understand barriers to refrigerant recovery and things that are fooling up mitigation projects. So with that knowledge that we've gained in the field, we've tried to implement it in strategically de-risking these projects. So first I'll tell you about an established pathway using carbon markets to finance ODS destruction. And this is what Tradewater's business is, as well as some other companies in this space. But as we know, the Montreal Protocol puts controls on the production and consumption of virgin gases. But once these gases are sold into the market, there are functionally no controls at a global level that prevent their release to the atmosphere. So Montreal Protocol is about controlling production and consumption, but not about controlling emissions. This means that in the case of ODS, there's actually a lot of chemical out there, either as seized illegal imports, so sitting in a port somewhere seized by a government, or in a stockpile. These could be recovered gases for which there's no longer demand, or just gases that have sat idle, forgotten, sometimes in a recovery cylinder, and otherwise unused. And unfortunately, these gases are leaking slowly into the atmosphere at known rates from cylinders, or they risk being vented to the atmosphere because they have no use to the technician. So this poses an environmental liability and emission for which carbon markets can fill a gap. So in the business as usual scenario, we have this gas sitting in cylinders, but no one's responsible for it and no one's willing to pay for the mitigation. And that's where carbon markets come in to finance these mitigation activities. So there are costs associated with dealing and mitigating these gases. The first is actually going out and finding and sourcing the gas, aggregating it, and testing it. Another is to actually export the gas such that it can be destroyed or to destroy it in country. As you may know, the Basel Convention, which is an international treaty of the movement of hazardous waste, transboundary, actually creates a lot of barriers in taking hazardous waste like HFCs and ODS and bringing it abroad, shipping it across borders to another country where it can be responsibly destroyed. So there's lots of time and cost associated with moving gas to a place where it can be destroyed responsibly. And lastly, there's cost of destroying the gas itself. These are costs like retrofitting a cement kiln with an ODS feeder. It also relates to the measurement and verification of the gas that you're destroying. And in some cases, also the labor and transport necessary to take the gas from wherever you find it to the destruction facility where it can be responsibly destroyed. And carbon markets are covering all those costs and also creating incentives for people to go out and find those gases. So next, I'm going to tell you about a new pathway. That is an existing pathway, Tradewater's business, but this is really what Charlie and I are working on every day at the Carbon Containment Lab, which is trying to take lessons learned from ozone-depleting substances and their application to carbon markets, and now applying it to hydrofluorocarbons in the Article 5 context. So I know that this idea of recovering HFCs and destroying them might be unfamiliar to some folks, and also it's new to the carbon market. So I'm going to explain the rationale and thesis for why we think this is a really important activity, and then explain some of the gaps that we're trying to fill with our own work. So the thesis is pretty straightforward, which is that refrigerant venting is the baseline case when the equipment reaches end of life, particularly in Article 5 countries, but frankly, all around the world. And this is because there are no end markets or small end markets for recovered refrigerant. And there aren't enough incentives for technicians to actually go out and recover gases, especially because monitoring technicians for refrigerant recoveries is really difficult and practically unenforceable. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into why refrigerant recovery isn't happening. And it largely comes down to the unit economics for refrigerant recovery. When you go out and try to recover refrigerant, you face certain costs. The first is actually driving to the job site. And another significant one is the time it takes you to recover refrigerant, which can be considerable in certain cases. And then once you have the gas in your cylinder, who's going to pay you for it? And if you're not going to get paid for it, there's no rationale for responsibly recovering. So carbon markets can fill an important role in creating the incentives for technicians to go out and recover gases. This picture Charlie and I took in Jakarta in January, and it's pretty interesting and instructive because there are two technicians who are riding on a motorbike to a job site, and they have a ladder on the back of their bike. They have a small can of virgin refrigerant. They have a jet cleaner to blow off the evaporator, and they have a ladder to climb up on the wall and service a mini stick. But they don't have enough space on their bikes for refrigerant recovery cylinders and refrigerant recovery machines. So the point of all of this is to show that not only do you need the right incentives, but you also need the incentive for project developers, for example, to invest in the infrastructure and enabling technology for technicians to actually go out and get the gas. So this is more complicated than just having a regulation telling technicians to go out and recover gases. It's more complicated than just trying to develop an enforcement mechanism for recovery. It's actually about trying to create the enabling infrastructure and financing. So currently, carbon markets cover a lot of activities in the refrigerant space, which I'll outline, but they also exclude major activities. So what's covered internationally is ODS destruction, as well as infrared automatic refrigerant leak detection. In North America, we have a couple standards that don't apply to the rest of the world. One of those is advanced refrigeration and foam blowing agents that is encouraging manufacturers to adopt lower GWP chemicals in those applications, as well as the reclaim and sale of refrigerant gases into the market. And in Mexico, interestingly, there's a protocol for halocarbon destruction that includes HFCs, but the big point here is that there's no coverage of HFC recovery and disposal. So functionally, there are no incentives globally to actually go out and recover HFCs and responsibly handle them. Now, what we're doing at the Yale Carbon Containment Lab is trying to fill that gap that I outlined right here on the slide, which is to actually write the standard that would enable the financing of HFC recovery and disposal. And currently, our standard, which is in draft form, is available for public comment. And we'd really appreciate everyone in this room to maybe scan the QR code and go and read it and offer public comment. We think that helps us develop better carbon market standards and a more robust understanding of additionality and measurement. So we have done hard work to make sure that we're responding to possibilities for perverse incentives, as well as any measurement issues that might arise. But we'd really appreciate your thoughts as well. More people work on this, the more robust it can be. And lastly, I'm going to talk about an emerging topic here. So I covered existing, new, and now I'll talk about emerging. And this is really about using carbon markets as a facilitator for nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. So I'll note that there's a section of the Paris Agreement called Article 6, which itself is actually just about 9 sentences, but has been operationalized over the past 7 years and negotiated very in pretty complex ways to actually bring it to a set of ideas into an actual framework for carbon trading and international carbon finance. So what Article 6 is doing is establishing set ways that countries can pay for emissions reductions in other countries as a way of meeting their NDCs. And this works in both market and non-market ways. But just so everyone is on the same page, I know that we're all following the climate world pretty closely nowadays, but what nationally determined contributions look like, especially in the developing country case, is that you have an unconditional contribution, which the country pledges to meet using its own resources, and a conditional contribution, which they say, oh, well, we'll meet this target if we can attract international financing to complete those projects. So this conditional contribution actually is where HFCs often live, or HFCs are not included in the NDC at all, because not all NDCs are economy-wide. So another way that Article 6 works is by setting up bilateral agreements where one country can buy carbon credits from another country, and these credits can help the buyer country meet its NDCs. So I wanted to just highlight a case study here where you have a host country who develops a project. Maybe they go out, recover HFCs, and then they destroy them. They can sell a portion of those emissions reductions to the buyer country, which is typically a developed country, like Switzerland. And then in return, that country provides financing for the project, technology, and capacity building. The host country can also opt to keep a portion of the credit for themselves. That way they can make progress toward their own NDC. And the buyer country can apply whatever credits they secured and bought to their own NDC. So this is a great way of not only helping countries make progress toward their NDCs, raising the ambition of the Paris Agreement, but also seed the infrastructure in the host country necessary to do HFC recovery and disposal at scale, for example. So it's not only about doing one-off projects, but also ensuring continuity within them. Now, I know this seems like an abstract concept, and frankly, Article 6 hasn't been fully operationalized around the world, although Article 6.2, which is this system here, is kind of in the works. But Japan has been doing this for a long time, and they've been doing this in partnership with countries such as Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines, actually crediting the recovery and disposal of fluorocarbons, including HFCs. So this isn't an unfamiliar concept to the world, and Japan has already been a leader in this. So looking at them as a model through the joint crediting mechanism can be a really useful and instructive exercise. I also want to talk about broadly why this matters for climate strategy as it relates to the overlap or interaction between the Paris Agreement and the Montreal Protocol. So there's been talk at this meeting about life cycle refrigerant management, which is this climate strategy that considers the emissions from the production, the use and leakage, as well as the end of life of refrigerants in equipment. And the Multilateral Fund, as I mentioned before, is primarily about restricting production and consumption and not about funding life cycle refrigerant management projects, which typically relate to emissions. But Multilateral Fund has funded some one-off projects that create destruction infrastructure in countries, for example, or reclamation infrastructure. But those projects typically have died because there isn't a business case to continue it. So I think the main point is that Multilateral Fund is doing a really important job in de-risking projects and also funding compliance-related measures, but it's never funded the long-term or ongoing, never provided long-term or ongoing financing for mitigation projects. And that's a gap that Article 6 can fill because it creates a business case and creates demand for these mitigation projects. So just highlighting here, MLF is now providing funds for refrigerant inventories, and that's useful for Article 6 because in order to generate a carbon credit, you need a good understanding of the baseline emissions case as well as what refrigerants you have in the country. So this is some really crucial overlap that we think could be exploited. Finding synergies in Paris Agreement and Montreal Protocol should be a major next step for everybody interested in climate. So with that, I'll close up. Thanks very much for your attention. Glad to answer questions next with Maho. And we'll circulate these slides afterwards, but you have a nice fact sheet that Charlie put together on all the existing carbon market methodologies. So you can kind of scope out the space and understand what currently exists and whether it applies to your country or not. As always, Charlie and I are glad to engage with you about the carbon markets. We understand that there are a lot of people who are supportive, but a lot of people who are skeptical. We're somewhere in the middle. We engage with that probably more than any other environmental NGO, but are also really interested in not only writing the standards, but also figuring out how to develop new ones and to critique ones that we don't think have high integrity. So we're really curious to hear your thoughts and grateful for your attendance today. So I'll hand it back to Tradewater, but thanks very much.